Tucker Carlson walked into the studio knowing exactly what kind of interview this would be. The host, Alex Warren, a rising star in progressive media, had one goal: to take him down. The stage was set, the audience primed, the questions designed not to inform but to corner, to frame him as the face of misinformation. It wasn't a conversation, it was an ambush. For years, Tucker had been a target of the mainstream media, accused of fear-mongering, of spreading dangerous ideas, of manipulating his audience. And now, sitting under the harsh studio lights, across from a host who believed himself untouchable, he was expected to answer for it all. But there was just one problem. Alex thought he had control. He thought this was his moment. But within minutes, the balance of power would shift. The interview wouldn't go the way he planned, and by the time it was over, it wouldn't be Tucker Carlson struggling for answers. It would be the man who invited him. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. The stage was set, the lights harsh and unflattering, the kind designed to make every flicker of discomfort visible. The camera panned across the studio audience, a mix of eager anticipation and thinly veiled hostility. The show's host, a young, sharp-suited man with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable, leaned forward, hands clasped together on the sleek black desk. "Tonight," he began, his voice smooth yet heavy with implication, "we have a guest who needs no introduction. A man whose name has become synonymous with controversy, misinformation, and the erosion of trust in the media. A man who built his career stoking fear and division, only to call it the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, Tucker Carlson." The camera cut to Tucker, seated opposite the host, relaxed in his chair, an almost amused glint in his eyes. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether this introduction was meant to be an insult or just another lazy attempt at framing the conversation. He had been in this position before, countless times. The setup was always the same. The host believed himself the righteous arbiter of truth, the one who would finally expose Tucker Carlson as a fraud, a manipulator, a man whose words had real-world consequences. But Tucker had seen this play before, and he knew how it ended. The host smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Tucker, let's not waste any time. People accuse you of spreading dangerous misinformation, of fueling paranoia, of making millions by peddling lies that divide the country. And yet here you are, still insisting that you're just asking questions. At what point do you take responsibility for the damage you've done?" His tone was measured, but there was an edge to it, a barely concealed aggression beneath the practiced professionalism. He thought he had the upper hand. Tucker let the moment hang in the air, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make the host shift slightly in his seat. Then, finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the armrests. "That's an interesting way to start an interview," he said, his voice calm, deliberate. "Not with a question, but with an accusation. That tells me everything I need to know about what this is really about." A ripple of murmurs moved through the audience. The host's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But Tucker saw it. He always saw it. He could already tell this wasn't going to go the way the host had planned. The studio was a calculated construction of control, bright lights designed to amplify every shift in expression, sleek black surfaces reflecting the intensity of the moment, a stage that placed the host in a position of authority while the guest sat just slightly lower, a subtle yet intentional imbalance. The audience, carefully selected to lean toward the network's preferred demographic, sat in neat rows, their expressions ranging from passive curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Some clutched their hands together, waiting for the confrontation they had come to see, while others sat with arms crossed, skeptical but willing to be entertained. The host, Alex Warren, was a rising star in progressive media, a man known for his rapid-fire takedowns and rehearsed moral superiority. He had built his career on exposing high-profile figures who didn't align with his worldview, and tonight, Tucker Carlson was his target. He had prepared for this, studied every angle, rehearsed every line. He believed he had found the formula. cut in at the right moments, steer the conversation, keep control. His producers had armed him with graphics, pre-edited video clips, and audience cues, all designed to create the illusion of undeniable truth. Tucker sat opposite him, legs crossed, shoulders relaxed, exuding the effortless confidence of a man who had weathered every possible attack the media could throw at him. He knew the game, knew how it was played, and most importantly, knew that the person across from him underestimated him. His expression was unreadable, a slight smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, as if this was all mildly amusing to him. But behind that smirk, he was calculating, measuring every movement, every shift in tone, waiting for the inevitable overreach. A massive LED screen behind them flickered to life, playing a carefully selected montage of Tucker's most controversial segments. A headline flashed across the bottom of the screen: "Tucker Carlson, the most dangerous voice in media." The audience chuckled, a few scattered boos echoing through the room. The clips were cut with surgical precision, splicing moments out of context, turning rhetorical questions into declarations, playing ominous music beneath them to make his words sound more sinister. It was an old trick, one Tucker had seen before, but it was effective, at least for those who already wanted to believe it. Alex leaned forward, clasping his hands together in mock patience. "Tucker, you've built an entire career on fear-mongering and conspiracy theories. Your critics say you deliberately spread misinformation under the guise of just asking questions. But let's be honest. You're not asking questions. You're planting seeds of doubt, feeding paranoia, making people distrust the very institutions that keep our democracy intact." His voice was smooth, controlled, but there was an edge beneath it, a barely concealed sense of triumph. He thought this was his moment, that the pressure of the setup would force Tucker into a defensive stance. Tucker tilted his head slightly, as if considering the weight of the words. Then he let out a small chuckle, just enough to be heard, but not enough to seem dismissive. "It's fascinating," he said, his tone light, almost conversational. "You introduce me as a danger to democracy, but here I am, sitting in your studio, having a conversation with you, while your producers cut together out-of-context clips to make me look like a villain. If I were really so dangerous, why would you need to manipulate reality to prove it?" A flicker of something crossed Alex's face. Just a brief hesitation, almost imperceptible, but Tucker caught it. He knew that moment well. It was the instant a host realized their strategy wasn't working the way they had planned. The room was still against him, the audience preconditioned to root for their guy, but cracks were already forming. He could see a few people shifting in their seats, reconsidering what they had just watched. It was subtle, but it was there. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing Alex's composed yet slightly stiff expression. "Tucker," he continued, recovering quickly, "this isn't manipulation, this is accountability. You have one of the largest platforms in the country, and with that comes responsibility. You've amplified voices that have spread misinformation. You've defended people who—" Tucker held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Let me ask you something," he interrupted, his voice steady, measured. "Who decides what misinformation is? You? Your producers? The same media outlets that told us for years that the government never lies? That questioning official narratives is dangerous?" He let the words settle, watched as Alex's jaw tightened just slightly. He wasn't giving an answer yet, wasn't revealing his full hand. He was letting the pressure build, waiting for the right moment to turn the entire interview on its head. The studio's energy shifted, imperceptible to most but unmistakable to Tucker. He had been in this chair too many times to miss the signs. The next phase was coming, the host's attempt to tighten the grip, to force him into a corner. Tucker knew it before Alex did. He knew it before the producers fed the next line into his earpiece, and he was ready. Alex didn't miss a beat. He leaned in slightly, shifting his expression into something between a smirk and a look of practiced concern, the kind of look that suggested he wasn't just a journalist, he was the voice of reason, the arbiter of truth. "Tucker, let's cut through the theatrics. You like to play the victim, pretend that you're just a guy asking questions, but the reality is, your words have consequences. Your rhetoric has fueled dangerous conspiracy theories, some of which have led to real-world violence. Do you deny that?" The words were deliberate, calculated, a statement wrapped in a question designed to corner him. The audience reacted immediately, some nodding, others murmuring approval, waiting for Tucker to either stumble or lash out. They wanted to see him squirm. Alex wanted to see him squirm. Tucker, however, remained still. He didn't blink, didn't shift in his seat. He just let the moment hang, stretching it past the point of comfort, letting the weight of the accusation linger in the air before responding. "Let me get this straight," he said finally, his tone light, almost amused. "You're suggesting that because I talk about things that make people uncomfortable, I'm somehow responsible for their actions? That's an interesting standard. Should we apply it equally? Because I can think of a few networks, maybe even this one, that have spent years pushing narratives that turned out to be false, and I don't remember anyone here taking responsibility for the damage those caused." A murmur rippled through the audience. Alex's jaw tensed, but he recovered quickly. He wasn't going to let Tucker seize control this early. "False equivalence," he shot back. "We're not talking about journalistic mistakes. We're talking about you deliberately amplifying dangerous voices. Let's look at an example." He turned toward the massive screen behind them, where a video clip began to play. It was a segment from Tucker's old show, carefully cut to highlight a moment where he had discussed election fraud claims. The music underneath was ominous, the framing designed to make him look reckless, irresponsible. As the clip ended, Alex turned back, his expression grave. "That clip aired to millions of people. You gave credibility to a theory that had no evidence, that was debunked over and over again, and yet you kept pushing it. You see no problem with that?" Tucker exhaled slowly, shaking his head just slightly, as if the entire setup was almost disappointing in its predictability. "This is fascinating," he said, his voice calm, "because what you just did, taking a clip out of context, stripping it of nuance, presenting it as some kind of smoking gun, well, that's exactly what you're accusing me of doing. Do you realize that?" He let the words settle, watching as Alex's lips pressed together in a tight line. "And since we're talking about credibility, let me ask you this. How many times has this network had to retract stories? How many narratives have you pushed that turned out to be, let's say, incomplete at best?" Alex's face darkened, but he forced a thin smile. "This isn't about my network, Tucker. This is about you." "Of course it is," Tucker said smoothly. "Because if we started applying your standards across the board, we might have to talk about the time your network said Russian collusion was a fact, or the time you dismissed the Hunter Biden laptop story as disinformation, or when you told people that lockdowns would stop the spread of COVID indefinitely. None of that turned out to be true, but I don't remember anyone holding this show accountable for it." The room shifted. The tension was palpable now, the audience unsure whether to cheer or stay silent. Alex leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping against the desk. He could feel the balance slipping, but he wasn't done. Not yet. He straightened in his chair, reaching for another angle. "You love to deflect, Tucker, but let's talk about something specific. January 6th. You downplayed the severity of that day, suggested it wasn't as violent as the media portrayed. Do you still stand by that? Another trap? Another question designed to push him onto the defensive?" Tucker tilted his head slightly, as if genuinely intrigued by the approach. "I stand by facts," he said evenly, "and the fact is we now have footage that wasn't available when the media was hysterically pushing their narrative. Footage that shows people being let into the Capitol by police. Footage that contradicts a lot of what was initially reported. So if asking for transparency is downplaying an event, then sure, I guess I'm guilty of that." Alex's expression hardened. "So you're saying it wasn't an insurrection?" Tucker sighed, as if exhausted by the predictability of it all. "I'm saying the media cherry-picked what it wanted people to see, but since you're so interested in political violence, let's be consistent. Did you call the riots in 2020 an insurrection? Did you hold politicians accountable for encouraging them? Or does outrage only work in one direction?" The audience tensed. Alex's carefully constructed strategy was unraveling. He had come prepared for a battle he thought he controlled, but now he could feel himself being dragged into deeper waters, waters where Tucker thrived. The cracks in the facade were forming, and Tucker was just getting started. Alex's grip on the conversation was slipping, and he knew it. The audience could sense it too. The energy in the room had shifted. What started as an ambush was slowly turning into a battlefield where the host was no longer in control. His questions were hitting resistance. His carefully planned attacks weren't landing as intended. Tucker wasn't defensive, wasn't flustered, wasn't scrambling for explanations. He was standing his ground with the ease of someone who had done this dance 100 times before. But Alex wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. He straightened his shoulders, resetting his expression into one of forced composure. Tucker, you like to play these rhetorical games, but let's deal in reality. You just accused the media of cherry-picking narratives, yet you have spent years doing exactly that. You push fear, you amplify outrage, you tell people that they should be afraid of their own government. And that paranoia has consequences. There are people who take your words as marching orders, who believe every claim you make is fact. What do you say to them? It was a broad accusation, but Alex delivered it with precision, framing Tucker not just as irresponsible but as a dangerous figure, someone whose influence extended beyond commentary into action. He was trying to paint a picture not just of a controversial media figure, but of a man whose words had real-world casualties. It was an old strategy, an appeal to emotion over reason, and for a moment Alex thought he had found his opening. Tucker exhaled through his nose, a small, knowing smile forming at the edges of his lips. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice steady. When the media spent 4 years telling people that Trump was a Russian agent, when they claimed that democracy was under threat every single night, when they repeated lies that led to protests, violence, riots, who was held accountable for that? Did you ever sit in this chair and ask your colleagues whether they took responsibility for the damage they caused? Or does this standard only apply to people you disagree with? Alex clenched his jaw, but before he could interject, Tucker pressed forward. "I don't tell people to be afraid. I tell people to think critically." There's a difference. You see, the problem with your argument is that it assumes your side of the media is neutral, objective, harmless. But it's not. You want to talk about misinformation? Let's talk about the fact that your network dismissed the possibility of COVID coming from a lab leak. That wasn't allowed to be discussed. Now, years later, the government quietly admits it's a real possibility. But where are the apologies? Where are the retractions? A murmur ran through the audience. Even those who had come expecting an easy dismantling of Tucker Carlson were now shifting in their seats. Some leaned forward, eyes narrowed, listening more closely than before. Alex forced a breath, his fingers drumming against the desk. This is what you do, Tucker. You take unrelated issues, throw them into the mix, and pretend they somehow absolve you of your own responsibility. This isn't about CNN. This isn't about other networks. This is about you. Tucker's expression didn't change. He tilted his head slightly. That's convenient. When it's about me, it's accountability. When it's about you, it's deflection. Alex's nostrils flared just slightly. A tell, a micro-expression of irritation. He could feel himself losing the upper hand, the conversation slipping away from the narrative he had intended to construct. His producers were in his earpiece now, telling him to regain control, to push harder. He cleared his throat. Fine, let's bring this back to something concrete. January 6th, you downplayed it, you pushed a false narrative that it was just a peaceful protest, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and yet people listened to you, people believed you. Don't you feel any sense of responsibility for misleading them? Tucker leaned forward slightly, his hands resting lightly on the chair's armrests, his voice still calm but sharper now. Define false narrative, Alex, because what I actually said was that the media was selectively showing the most violent parts of that day while ignoring footage that complicated their story, and, surprise, that turned out to be true. But let's take your argument at face value. If I bear responsibility for what people believe, then so do you. Did your network feel responsible when it told people that Supreme Court justices were stripping away their rights, leading to mobs showing up at their homes? Or is it only dangerous rhetoric when it comes from someone like me? The question lingered. It wasn't a direct attack, but it was a wedge, driving doubt into Alex's carefully constructed moral high ground. Alex shifted in his seat, visibly frustrated now. That's not the same thing, and you know it." Tucker raised an eyebrow. "Explain why." For a second, just a second, Alex hesitated. It was imperceptible to the untrained eye, but Tucker saw it. It was the moment where someone realized they had walked into their own trap. He let the silence stretch, watching as Alex scrambled internally to decide how to pivot, but the silence was working against him. The audience wasn't on his side the way it had been at the start. They weren't fully on Tucker's side yet, but they were listening. Alex finally shook his head, exhaling sharply. "You love playing the victim, don't you?" Tucker let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "I'm sitting on your show, under your lights, answering your questions, while you play a montage of clips designed to make me look bad. And I'm the one playing the victim?" He let the absurdity of that statement settle. "That's interesting." The audience reaction was immediate. Some laughter, a few scattered claps, an energy shift that Alex couldn't ignore. His producers were likely screaming in his ear now, telling him to pivot, to regain control before it was too late, but it was already happening. Tucker Carlson wasn't the one on the defensive anymore. Alex could feel it now, the weight of the conversation slipping further out of his grasp. The energy in the room had changed. The dynamic he had so carefully constructed was fracturing, and worse, he could see it happening in real time. His job was to control the narrative, to lead Tucker into a series of traps, where every response could be reframed as an admission, a stumble, a sign of weakness. Instead, Tucker was methodically dismantling each accusation, turning the questions back on him, forcing him onto the defensive. It wasn't supposed to go like this. His producers were likely feeding him new angles in his earpiece, but it didn't matter. He was already bleeding control, and Tucker knew it. Alex straightened in his chair, forcing a smirk, trying to mask the irritation creeping into his voice. "All right, Tucker, let's stop dancing around and get to the core of this. You've built a career by positioning yourself as the guy who tells it like it is. But let's be honest, what you do isn't journalism. It's performance. You frame narratives, you push speculation as fact, and when you're confronted with the consequences, you deflect. And here's the real question. If you had to choose, would you rather be respected or feared?" It was meant to be a trap, a way to force Tucker into choosing between credibility and influence. Either way, Alex believed he could spin the answer into something damning. If Tucker claimed he wanted respect, Alex would counter that respected journalists didn't peddle conspiracy theories. If he said he wanted influence, Alex would argue that it proved Tucker was only in it for the power. It was a carefully worded ambush. But Tucker didn't blink. Instead, he let out a short breath, shook his head slightly, and smiled. Not the forced, calculated smile of someone maneuvering through a hostile interview, but a genuine, amused expression. "That's an interesting question," Tucker said, his voice steady, his tone almost conversational. "But let me ask you something in return. If you had to choose, would you rather be a journalist or an activist?" The words landed like a gunshot. The audience, which had been murmuring and shifting uneasily throughout the interview, suddenly went quiet. Alex's lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't the question itself that caught him off guard. It was the way Tucker had flipped the moment, effortlessly shifting the scrutiny back onto him. Alex forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "That's not an answer, Tucker." "No, it's not." Tucker agreed. "It's a question, a fair one, I think, because I came here expecting to be asked tough questions, to defend my views, but so far, every question has had the same underlying assumption, that your side is the one telling the truth and mine is the one corrupting it. So let's be honest about what this is. This isn't journalism. This is an inquisition. And the irony is, if I were really the threat you claim I am, you wouldn't need to do any of this. The truth speaks for itself. The fact that you have to frame it, manipulate it, and control the context tells me everything I need to know." The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Alex shifted in his seat, but for the first time, he didn't have an immediate response. He could feel the air in the room growing denser, the audience less sure of who was winning this exchange. Tucker leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the chair's armrests. "The thing about truth, Alex, is that it doesn't need to be curated. It doesn't need music tracks, dramatic edits, or loaded questions. It doesn't need a media empire behind it to make sure people believe it. And yet, that's exactly what you're doing here. If I were as wrong as you claim, if my words were as dangerous as you say, you wouldn't need to carefully construct a case against me. The facts would do it for you. But that's not what's happening, is it? Alex exhaled through his nose, shifting in his chair. He could hear the static in his earpiece, the producers scrambling to redirect, but there was no easy pivot from this. The audience wasn't reacting the way they had at the start. No easy laughs at Tucker's expense, no cheers for the host's takedowns. Instead, there was a new kind of tension in the air, one that Alex recognized all too well. Doubt. He opened his mouth, grasping for a way to reclaim control, but before he could speak, Tucker delivered the final push. Here's the real problem, Alex. You want to hold people like me accountable, but who holds you accountable? You act as though your version of reality is the only one that exists, that anyone who questions it is dangerous. But what happens when you're wrong? What happens when the institutions you defend aren't acting in good faith? Shouldn't a journalist want to ask those questions instead of working overtime to silence the people who do? The silence stretched. Someone coughed. A few people in the audience shifted, glancing at each other, waiting for Alex's response. He could feel their eyes on him, their expectation. He was supposed to win this debate, to prove once and for all that Tucker Carlson was nothing more than a manipulator, a fearmonger. Instead, he was now the one being examined. He forced another chuckle, though it landed flat. "I think we've let you ramble long enough," he said, his voice tighter than before. "Let's move on." But it was too late. The moment had passed, and everyone in the room knew it. Alex's attempt to move on was a feeble one, and everyone in the room could feel it. The control he once had, the dominance of the interview, the confidence in his pre-planned attacks, had slipped through his fingers. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. The carefully crafted montage, the leading questions, the condescending tone, none of it had worked. Tucker hadn't just survived the ambush, he had turned it around. And now, Alex was the one struggling to keep his footing. Tucker leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, almost bored, as if he had expected this outcome from the moment he walked onto the stage. He let Alex's words hang in the air, unchallenged, giving them the weight of their own weakness. The host was trying to force the conversation forward, to reset the rhythm before it was too late, but Tucker wasn't going to let him off that easily. "Move on?" Tucker repeated, tilting his head slightly. That's convenient. You spent the last 20 minutes telling your audience that I'm dangerous, that my words have consequences, that I'm responsible for the way people interpret reality. But the moment the conversation turns to whether your network does the exact same thing, suddenly it's time to move on? The audience stirred, a few scattered chuckles, someone coughed. Even those who had come expecting to cheer for Alex could sense what was happening. The shift wasn't just in Tucker's tone. It was in the unspoken acknowledgement that Alex had no answer. And the worst part? He wasn't even trying to find one. He just wanted the moment to pass. Tucker didn't let it. "See, this is what I love about these conversations," he continued, his voice light, almost amused. "You bring someone like me on, you load up a bunch of pre-cut video clips, you frame every question like a courtroom interrogation, and when it doesn't go the way you planned, you pretend it never happened." "It's fascinating." Alex stiffened. "That's not what's happening here." Tucker raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it? Because I just asked you a simple question, who holds you accountable? And instead of answering it, you want to change the subject. Why is that?" Alex exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers tightening against the desk. "Tucker, this isn't about me." "That's exactly my point," Tucker said, leaning forward slightly. "It's never about you. It's never about this network or the way you push narratives, just as much as you accuse me of doing. It's always about the people you disagree with, the ones you think need to be silenced, fact-checked, framed as threats. But when you get called out on it, when the same questions get turned back on you, suddenly it's not worth discussing." The room was completely still now, The audience wasn't just watching a debate anymore, they were watching something unravel. Alex had no cards left to play, and everyone, including him, knew it. "I think we've given you more than enough time to spin this conversation into whatever you want it to be," Alex said, his voice tight, his patience fraying. "But the fact remains, your rhetoric has done damage, and that's why you're here. People deserve to hear the truth." Tucker let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "The truth," he echoed. "That's a great word. But the problem is, your definition of truth depends entirely on who's saying it. You don't want a conversation, you want a confession. And when you don't get one, you declare yourself the winner and hope nobody notices that you lost." The words landed like a hammer. Alex opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. His face was tense, his eyes darting slightly to the side, as if waiting for someone to step in, to pull him out of this. But there was no one coming to save him. He was alone in the moment he had created. Tucker took his time. He adjusted his posture, giving the silence a chance to stretch, to settle. Then he smiled, not in triumph, not in mockery, but in the quiet acknowledgement of a battle already decided. He glanced toward the camera, as if addressing the audience directly, bypassing the man in front of him entirely. "This was fun," he said, standing up. "Thanks for having me." He didn't wait for Alex's response. He didn't need to. He simply turned, nodded toward the audience, and walked off the stage. The cameras followed him for a few seconds before cutting back to Alex, who was still sitting there, his jaw tight, his hands clenched together. He forced a smile, but it was weak, forced, artificial. "We'll be right back," he said, his voice flatter than before. The screen cut to black, but by then it didn't matter. The moment was already out of his hands. Within minutes of the interview ending, the internet erupted. Clips of Tucker's responses flooded social media, spreading like wildfire. Hashtags like "Tucker owns the media" and "Who holds you accountable" trended on X, formerly Twitter, with millions of users dissecting every moment of the exchange. The most viral clip, Tucker leaning forward, calmly asking "Who holds you accountable?" while Alex sat in silence, racked up millions of views in hours. Memes followed instantly. Screenshots of Alex's frozen expression, his forced smile, his visible frustration. Users paired them with captions like, "When your own interview turns against you," and "The moment he knew he lost." Media outlets scrambled to control the fallout. Predictably, some rushed to Alex's defense, framing the interview as an intense but necessary confrontation and claiming that Tucker had dodged key questions. But that narrative wasn't sticking. Even those who typically opposed Tucker found themselves questioning what they had just watched. The tone in comment sections, on forums, in reaction videos was shifting. This wasn't just another heated debate, this was something else. People who had tuned in expecting to see Tucker struggle instead watched a host crumble under the weight of his own tactics. He walked into his own trap, one user posted, attaching a gif of someone stepping on a rake. Others weren't as subtle. This was a complete self-own. If you're gonna try to take Tucker down, maybe don't make it so obvious you're running defense for your own network. On Alex's end, damage control had already begun. His team quickly clipped together a highlight reel, cutting out the worst moments, trying to reshape the conversation. The official show account tweeted, "A hard-hitting interview with Tucker Carlson. Watch the full episode now." But the replies told the real story. Thousands of comments, overwhelmingly mocking. "Yeah, we watched it. You got wrecked. How does it feel to lose control of your own show? You were supposed to expose him, and instead you exposed yourself." It wasn't just social media. YouTube reaction videos analyzing the interview flooded in, racking up views by the millions. Conservative commentators called it a masterclass in dismantling media narratives, while even some moderate voices admitted that Alex had underestimated his guest. A few high-profile journalists, clearly uncomfortable with the reaction, subtly distanced themselves. "Maybe we need to rethink how we handle these kinds of interviews," one posted. By the next morning, the story had reached mainstream headlines. "Tucker Carlson shifts the narrative in viral interview," ran on independent news sites. Even outlets traditionally hostile toward him struggled to frame the event as a win for their side. Some avoided covering it entirely. Others tried to spin it as an example of why media must be more prepared when facing disinformation experts. Meanwhile, Tucker said nothing. No posts, no comments, no statements. He didn't need to. The internet had already decided the winner.